Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Jeremy Dauber. Jeremy, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, it's great to be here. My name is Jeremy Dauber. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I recently published a book about Mel Brooks.
Thank you so much for coming on today. So, yes, we're going to be talking about your new book, fairly new. It came out in March, right?
That's right.
Mel Brooks, Disobedient Jew is the title and subtitle, and it's part of the Jewish Lives series from Yale University Press. So this is a well-established series of on the shorter side, biographies of famous Jews. How did you end up writing one about Mel Brooks?
Well, the short answer to that question is they asked me, and I said yes. But the slightly longer answer is that I've spent a lot of my time at Columbia teaching and then writing about Jewish comedy. I had wrote a different book about a history of Jewish comedy, a more broad book, a few years back, and so it was something that was a matter of intellectual interest to me. It's a matter of just fun, and I'd grown up watching Mel Brooks movies as well, so the opportunity to really dig more deeply into his work and think about it sort of more coherently was just a great opportunity. So it was a great chance to do it, and it was a lot of fun.
There's a list in the back of my copy of both the published titles and the forthcoming titles. It's a very impressive series, and some of the people who have been covered. Well, it starts first alphabetically, Rabbi Akiva, the Talmudic sage, and let's see, Karl Marx, Arthur Miller, and then future ones include Abraham, the biblical patriarch, and Jesus. So there's quite a wide range going from biblical times to modern day. And Mel Brooks, of course, is as of this taping, is still alive. He's like 98 years old or so.
Right. He's 97, and he's a 2,000-year-old man. So it seems
yeah. So he himself.
That's right.
Yeah, his most famous, or not maybe not his most famous bit, but one of the bits that catapulted him to stardom involves this idea of someone who was like Jesus's, neighbor or something like that. What about Brooks's life or his story or what he represents? What appealed to you in particular?
Well, one of the other sides of the things that I do is not only do I work on Jewish literature and Jewish studies, but I also do American culture, American popular culture mostly. And I had written a book not too long ago on American comic books, for example. So this idea of the intersection between those, Jewish literature and culture, American culture, really in some ways, Mel Brooks is at the epicenter of that intersection because he really is sort of the apotheosis of a kind of American Jewish cultural enterprise and endeavor to really, on the one hand, try and make yourself at the heart of American culture, really sort of beloved by all of America, right? By entertaining them, right? But also at the same time saying there's something about me and there's something about my kind of approach to things that is never really going to be fully comfortably American. And so my position, which will lead me to the centrality of fame and popular acclaim, is to be kind of a loyal opposition, right? And one of the that I suggest is to be this kind of disobedient Jew, but within the system, right? To have this kind of licensed anarchy and parody, which of course is how Mel Brooks made his biggest reputation, is sort of the actual concretized form of that in comedy, because you have this very kind of both loving and adoring relationship to the material that you're parodying, but also you're saying, look, it's literally ridiculous. You can ridicule it, or you can make fun of it, or you can chaff at it and things like that. So that's sort of Brooks in a nutshell.
Could you explain the anecdote of where this subtitle "Disobedient Jew" comes from?
Sure, absolutely, yes. So for those of you, I think anyone listening to this knows Mel Brooks, but probably you may or may not know that he used to sign his letters, "Your obedient Jew, Mel Brooks," right? And so therefore I took off on that in sort of subtitling the book. And part of the joke of Brooks's signature, right, is that although he may have been loving and adoring and all these kind of things to American culture, he was never really obedient. And even in writing that, he kind of was making that clear that he was not being obedient. He was sort of sticking a finger in the eye, but he was doing it in a way that also harnessed that to his Jewishness, right? It's your obedient Jew, not your obedient servant, which was the older version of this, right? So that is where I took this from, and in some ways, it was a little bit of a key to unlocking kind of who this guy was for me.
Mm-hmm. This is somewhat of a tangent, but I think it's interesting. So your previous book is American Comics: A History, and probably most people know by now that a lot of the early comic book creators were Jewish. The two guys who created Superman, Schuster and Siegel, I think are their names, they were Jewish, right. And then Stan Lee is Jewish, and Jack Kirby is Jewish, and I had either read or maybe somehow thought myself that one of the reasons for this is that a lot of the skills that someone had to in the early comic book years, that type of person would maybe naturally go towards like fine illustration or advertising in the Mad Men world, and those industries were closed off because of anti-Semitism to Jews. So the Jews were sort of like relegated to this like disrespected genre of comic books, which was like, garbage for kids and teenagers. And they had to, make their own way in this form that was not respected. And it's sort of like maybe early Hollywood and sort of like, like Broadway was more respectable, and then if Jews weren't able to participate there, they went and did their own thing. Do you see a connection there between Brooks's life and that sort of, people who weren't allowed to advance in the like WASP-dominated industries?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that, the key to sort of American Jewish cultural success is a combination very frequently of two things, and they both apply with both comic books and Mel Brooks. The first, as you said, absolutely is barriers to employment in high status areas thanks to anti-Semitism and discrimination. One way we can see this is it was actually a quite high status thing to be a comic strip drawer in the newspapers that preceded comic books. And that was really populated by non-Jews. And there were there were very few Jews in the comic strip business. And then, as you say, the entire comic book business is Jewish, or sometimes other white ethnics at the beginning, like Italians, were subject to this kind of discrimination. So there's that side of it. And certainly, so much of the Borscht Belt in which Mel Brooks, an American Jewish comedy, got its start in many ways in that post-war period was because of discrimination. If there had not been restrictions on Jews being in hotels and other kind of Catskills hotels, they wouldn't have created this kind of Jewish hotel ecosystem that really, birthed American Jewish and then in many ways American post-war comedy. The second effect, or the second factor, which applies both to comic books and to Mel Brooks, is network effects. So, you would say, I have a job making comic books, or I have a job in, one of these industries. Who am I going to hire? Well, somebody I know, somebody who's local and I know and who's talented, I'll hire my cousin. Of course, that's how Stan Lee gets his first job. He's literally a cousin or a wife's cousin of Martin Goodman, who owned the company that was basically Marvel Comics. Mm-hmm. Similarly, Mel Brooks is known. He sort of hangs around the mountains. He gets to know Sid Caesar. He gets to know that crew. And when Caesar has your show of shows, he takes along this guy who he kind of met, right? And there's all of these kind of networks that go into the creation of that sort of first explosion of live television that your show of shows really dominates and really gives Mel Brooks his real launch.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why don't we talk about that period, or I guess the period preceding that, leading up to sort of the Borscht Belt era, and what was Brooks's childhood like, and what was his, his family of origin like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think, the two or three things that I'll say, and, of course, anyone who's listening to this, if you want to hear more, you can read about it in the book. But one big thing is that Mel Brooks's father dies when he's basically a baby, or a toddler. And so, there is a lot of comedy that comes out of this kind of familial loss or this familial trauma. A lot of comedians have some version of this in common. This is certainly the case with Mel Brooks, and he spends a lot of his life, looking for certain kinds of father figures, and really he finds that in Sid Caesar in a very fundamental way. So that's one sort of very important fact, that sort of need to be adored, that kind of need secondarily to find a father figure. That's very big for him. The second is, he grows up in Brooklyn in this very kind of Jewish space, right? This very comfortable, Hamish, as we would say, this homey kind of Jewish space that he's in, and that gives him a kind of comfort, of course, with his Jewishness, that's sort of organic and natural. And he's an outer borough kid. He's not a Manhattanite, and so he sort of dreams of Broadway, right? He is, Brooks, as we're saying, is in his late 90s. He really grows up in some ways, even in the early days of movies, but where really the cultural center, the thing that you really aspired to, really was not to be a movie star, right? Was to be a theater person. Mm-hmm. And that has really stayed, obviously, with him throughout his entire life in a way that, people a generation or two generations after him, even if they're making movies at the same time, are not necessarily quite in sync with him. Steven Spielberg grows up as a film kid, even though Jaws is coming out like almost exactly at the same time as Young Frankenstein, there's a theater guy, but also, of course, a movie guy. I mean, he's growing up as a little kid in the age of those first sound films and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, those are the aspects. And then the last thing I'll say, as Brooks gets a little bit older, we talk, and I suspect we'll get to this. We talk about the producers, about sort of fighting Nazis, right? And it's important to remember that Brooks is a World War II veteran. Brooks actually fought Nazis. He literally did. So that's an important thing to keep in mind too. He was a soldier. He was in Europe. He saw, what was going on, in World War II. He had a family, maybe had a brother who also served, who was a prisoner of war for a while. This was a guy who really sort of lived through those moments in American history as well, even though, of course, we associate him as a post-war figure. Mm-hmm. His formative experiences, he's a greatest generation guy. He is not a baby boomer, even though, as I say, baby boomers are producing some of their most important works also at the same time that he's producing his.
Mm-hmm. Did he speak Yiddish at home growing up?
He spoke English growing up, but he certainly knew Yiddish. He was very familiar with it. He could speak it, but he grew up as an English speaker.
Okay. The 2,000-year-old man, and then some of his other characters, like that short film that won the Academy Award, is sort of the persona of the older Jewish immigrant man with that accent. So I guess that was just the older generation that he was exposed to growing up.
Yeah, he says actually that he grows up with all those voices in his head, all those voices around him. Those are the voices he grows up with, right? Meaning he is growing up hearing them, right? And he's like, they will vanish. He literally says this. He's like, they'll vanish. And this is in some ways his fond commemoration of those voices. But as you know from listening to Mel Brooks talk, it's a voice that he slips into rather than his own voice, right? That's not how he speaks. So it's a persona for him, and he does it, of course, extraordinarily well. But in that way, it's a kind of disguise. Just as very famously, the Yiddish-speaking Native Americans in Blazing Saddles are also a disguise, right? But they're and not a good one in all sorts of ways. But it's meant to show, right? But it is a disguise.
Right. So it's sort of like he's between, he's between the generations and assimilation, and could understand or speak Yiddish, but English is primary thing. So it's sort of a, code switching situation. Okay. So he gets back from the war, and what's his next step, and how does he end up becoming this like Borscht Belt performer?
So, he already during the war, he already knows that he wants to kind of be an entertainer. That's sort of his job for most of the time in the war. He's kind of arranging GI entertainment, things like that. And he tries to make a living of it, in this post-war period. And he is not necessarily doing so amazing, right? One of the things that I like doing in the book is making sure, we think of Mel Brooks as this monumental success, which of course he is. But it takes him quite a bunch of failure on the way to becoming a success, as it does for so many of us. And so he, you have to tell that part of the story to tell who he is too. So he's floundering a little bit, one of those first periods of his floundering. And he finally, through some connection, and he'd been going up even before he went to the war. He'd been going up a little bit to the mountains, in various different kinds of positions. But really, the most important thing, as so frequently it is in life, that happens to him is that he makes a connection while he's up there, right? And that connection, of course, is Sid Caesar. And Caesar was, this undisputed Olympian monumental talent of the mountains. Everyone who saw him understood that this was a kind of sui generis figure, just in terms of the talent, the profile, sort of, all of this. And Caesar had started working with this guy, Max Liebman, who was in charge of putting together some of these incredible shows that ran in the Borscht Belt, live entertainment that went over a new show every night. And then, television starts, and they say, they say to Liebman, we'd like you to produce some of these shows, this television show. And we want you to try and put together a group of people who can put on a brand new entertainment every week, And so he says, well, of course, I'm going to go to my contact to the mountains. So he brings Caesar, and then Caesar brings Brooks along. And that is the beginning of, I don't want to quite call it a partnership, that would overstate Brooks' his role on your show of shows, but that begins, sort of the next stage in this relationship. And of course, as I say, launches Brooks onto his own career.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk more about your show of shows and like what made it different or new at the time? And because it's not like, I don't know, it's part of the culture, but also like, I'm not sure it has the level of like current cultural knowledge or resonance or something that maybe
it was a very long time ago. I mean, it was
so 70 plus years, I guess.
Yeah, it was so long that when you ask, what's new about your shows, in some ways the answer is everything, right? Because it really sort of fundamentally is one of those shows at the beginning of small screens. I mean, nowadays, you used to be able to call it television, but now you might just say streaming content into your home, right? And that was very important. I mean, one of the points I make in the book is that, it's not called my show of shows, right? It's called your show of shows, right? It's bringing this entertainment into your home. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, and as a result, it has to be, and I'm using this word for the second time in our interview, Hamish. It has to be kind of homey, right? Because otherwise it won't be appropriate for the house. So, it is all of these different kinds of things at once. One of the reasons it's called your show of shows is because it brings together a lot of different kinds of entertainment, including parodies, right? Which will become Brooks's métier, both on the show and afterwards. It also is very famous for featuring a writer's room, which Brooks worked in, which would have, between it and the show that came after it, kind of a murderer's row, again, of post-war talent, including at different incarnations of Caesar's shows, including Mel Brooks, including Woody Allen, including Neil Simon, including Larry Gelbart, who went on to do MASH, and other people who people might know less, but still are monumental figures in their own right. And, you would have, and almost all of these people were Jewish, right? So, and Brooks was part of all of this that really helped to develop the grammar of television, of post-war entertainment, and of course, reigning over all of it was Sid Caesar, who was just, he was in almost everything. He was in the writer's room, sort of figuring out what worked and what didn't work. He was, of course, the lead of the show. Just a monumental task to have 90 minutes of live television a night, where, unlike even Saturday Night Live now, but where you are the kind of star. And it was he had just a tremendously talented cast with him, but this was not surprisingly just a force in American culture for a couple of years in the very early 1950s.
Were there ever critics who didn't like how the Caesar himself and the crew and cast were overwhelmingly Jewish, or like thinking this show was too Jewish for the rest of America?
Well, that's a great question because I would say two things. Television at this point, right? We might now think like the iPhone that television rolls out and it's everywhere all at once, right? But it really wasn't. So television starts in major markets in big cities, which were disproportionately Jewish, and only rolls out kind of slowly over the years. So the idea on the one hand that a show was kind of, let's use these code words because this was the way people, right? Cosmopolitan and urban and all these kind of things, right? That wasn't a bug. That was a kind of feature at that point. And in fact, part of the reason that television changed was that audiences became much more heterogeneous in terms of their interests, and shows had to sort of change that. The other aspect was, and this is equally important, was that Caesar's show does not, even though we think of it as a very Jewish show and talking about it maybe because of the writers, it does not come across particularly as deeply Jewish, right? See, there's very little on the show that if you were not Jewish, you would sort of be able to perk your ears up and say, oh, this is a Jewish show.
Okay.
There are occasional code words, occasionally there's a Yiddish phrase that's sort of very vaguely thrown in, but it's often disguised in a way that you wouldn't necessarily know that you were missing anything.
So is this where he meets Reiner, or did he meet Reiner before this?
He meets Reiner yes, right there. He meets Reiner in your show of shows. So Reiner is, a much bigger figure at the time than Mel Brooks is. Brooks is sort of Sid Caesar's little friend who's doing a little bit of work, right? Reiner is not only in the writer's room as a writer, but he's, of course, a regular performer. He's the second lead almost on the show. I don't like the phrase second banana because that diminishes the work of those kind of, but he, Caesar was the undisputed, lead, right? And there was Reiner, who was just also doing a yeoman's amount of work on the show and brilliant comic. So, but of course, Reiner and Brooks became good friends, very good friends, best friends for many decades until Reiner's death.
So let's talk about the 2,000-year-old man, which is their collaboration, and how that bit came to be, or what was the origin of that?
So, again, I talk a lot about this in the book, and I suggest that people read it if they're interested in hearing more, but we'll talk about it a little bit here. That essentially what happens is that this is an act that is developed, as so many sort of acts ahead of their time are, inside the writer's room, and then is rejected as not possibly being good for the show, right? And the reason there, and Carl Reiner in his memoirs is very explicit about this, is that they are too Jewish, right? So, and at this point, Reiner is saying, look, it's really right after the Holocaust, okay? And it is, this idea that a number of people are looking around and they're saying, what role does Jewish comedy have? Not in, God forbid, thinking in creating the Holocaust or anything like that, but in perpetuating certain kinds of anti-Semitic actions or stereotypes or what have you. And so there was, in vaudeville and everything, there was all of this Jewish dialect comedy, right? And they sort of said, we're going to cool that a little bit. That we're a little worried that's going to give aid and comfort to people who we don't like necessarily. So that really is one of the reasons that they felt that, or Reiner claims anyway, that they felt that they couldn't do this. When they developed it, as sort of in the writer's room of your shows. And also, I think they were worried that it would be too inside baseball, it would be too Jewish, all those kinds of things. But so they do it, they play it at show business parties, they get big hits after this. And as they're doing it, that aspect of is Jewish comedy too Jewish for America begins to change. And by the time it becomes around the very late 1950s, very early 1960s, there's been really a sea change in that question. It's been 15 years since the end of World War II. Things are changing. And, a number of people are saying, look, you really need to put this out. And I tell a nice story in the book, which I will leave for the book, but about Cary Grant and the Queen of England. So, a little enticement for people. So that, but basically there was a consensus that maybe it was okay to put this on record now, and which was what it was on. It was on a long playing comedy record, and that then goes out and it does quite well, and that really begins, an upward trajectory for Mel Brooks's career.
Right, and the origin, at least reportedly, this sounds sort of like print the legend kind of thing, is that they were sort of like bullshitting in the writer's room, and Reiner turned to Mel Brooks and said like, oh, we have here a man who 2,000 years old and has witnessed the crucifixion. Like, what was it like? And then, just out of nowhere. And then Brooks, said, oh boy, or something to that effect. And that improvisatory, it was improv, which is now taken over comedy basically, in that sort of before was really codified as its own genre, I guess. But the records themselves, when they were doing these bits at parties and stuff that must have been fully improvised, right? But when they did the actual recording and stuff, was that also improvised, or were they redoing their best bits?
So two things, right? That seems to be the first thing you said. The anecdote with I understand you were right. That seems to have been, everyone basically agrees, that first joke, sort of in the writer's room or something like that, right? Where there had been one of the things that your shows did was this parody of news reporters. They called it non-entities in the news, right? So they were used to kind of working in that kind of métier, and so they do this, right? And then and then it's oh boy, right? And then, as you say, and then it sort of starts. Over the years, they would do it at these show business parties. Almost all of that would be, of course, improvised. And Reiner, I mean, again, very frequently people think of this as a Mel Brooks 2,000-year-old man thing, but it really is a double act, right? And it can't work without Reiner really pushing Brooks, changing the subject when he's getting lost, sharpening things, begging him to go deeper, that kind of thing. It's a really amazing sort of dual performance for both of them, of which, of course, the showier part is Brooks's, but it really requires both. When they finally get to putting it on record, it does seem that from what we know, that it was not totally improvised, that it was done improvisationally, but they did a couple of takes and they kind of put together some of the best takes. So it's not one ongoing performance, but the vast majority of it is really a brilliantly controlled Carl Reiner chasing down Mel Brooks's incredible, fertile, wacky imagination, right? And seeing what it will come up with under pressure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's skip ahead chronologically a little bit, and people who want the full chronological story can read the book. But let's skip ahead to the producer. So he's in television. He creates to Get Smart, and then he wants to get into movies. And how does I mean this is a big question. How does the producers come to be, and how does he actually pull this thing off of that this is his first movie, and it's this crazy idea that is still sort of radical today?
Right. So the thing is, I mean, Brooks has been around show business by this point for a long time, right? So he knows everybody knows him. He's been, as you say, he's been successful in television. He's been working in theater. He's never quite broken into the theater, which is this dream of his, but he's been involved as a play doctor, right? For a long time. He's been involved with a lot of projects, most of which did not go anywhere. Others were flops. But for a long time, he was been thinking about writing a play, or first a novel and then maybe a play, called sort of Springtime for Hitler. And as we all know. And at one point he shows this big producer, what he's got when he thinks it's a play. And they say, The producer says to him, you know what? There's too many scenes. There's too many characters. This isn't a play. It's a movie. And, even with all of, at this point, by the way, he's won an Oscar for that short film that you referred to before, right? Even with all that, as you can imagine, it is hard to get money for this movie. This is not a movie that everyone's like, yes, this is going to be a family pleasing 4-quadrant production, right? This is, but people manage. He shows it to this one producer. The producer very much thinks it's hilarious. Is willing to put up some of the money, but this is really a kind of a smaller production, and nobody really knows how it's going to do. And the truth is that it's considered a huge classic, but commercially it does not do very well at all. And Brooks's wife, Anne Bancroft, is in a little movie that comes out almost exactly the same time, involving almost many of the same people, called The Graduate, which of course is also a small movie. That does, phenomenally, right? I mean, this is a massive hit. So, Brooks does get, it should be said, Brooks does win an Oscar for the movie. He wins an Oscar for the screenplay, which is quite impressive. But it's really, and he does get enough money to make his next movie, which is this very interesting movie called The 12 Chairs, but which also, does nothing commercially. And then, so who knows whether this is going to have any success kind of in the movies going forward. But, he has enough juice to continue to get the opportunity to make Blazing Saddles. And after that, the rest of it is history.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about parody being sort of like his main form? He produces is not parody. And I mean, just like so when I was a kid, in the 80s and 90s, the Mel Brooks I was exposed to was Robin Hood Men in Tights, which I think I saw in theaters when it came out, and then the Star Wars parody whose name is escaping me, Spaceballs, which I liked a lot as a little kid. What attracted him to parody? Why do you think that became his main form?
Well, this gets back to what we talked about, I think, at the beginning of the interview, or the discussion, which is that I really think that parody is a way of, I don't think it was as thematic as this for him, but of expressing his own sort of conflicted feelings towards authority, towards America, towards being an outsider and an insider, right? Where he says, I love all of this stuff. I love Westerns. I love horror movies, right? I love these. I love Robin Hood. I love all of these things. They're part of me, but I don't see myself in them, right? I'm not, in some ways, these things are not part of what I am. How do I get myself in there? And the way in which he's found that is by saying, I'm going to poke fun at them. I'm going to show all of the things that they're missing in certain kinds of ways. And of course, the most famous of this, certainly for many years, the most famous aspect of this was the flatulence scene in Blazing Saddles,
Mm-hmm.
where he says, there have been I've watched millions of hours of people eating beans around a campfire, right? But nobody has ever shown what happens when you eat a lot of beans around a campfire, right? And I'm going to show that. I'm going to show what's
So what is it? The first fart in American cinema? Is that accurate?
I'm always leery of saying that things are the first of anything because, you're always going to find someone who's going to say, but wait, but it's certainly the most impactful early farting scene. I think I can feel comfortable saying that as a cultural historian. And it's also important because, for lack of a better phrase, it's harnessed to this kind of real aesthetic drive. I mean, I think it's not political drive in some ways. Brooks is very open in interviews around the time, not just later on, but around the time, saying, we are going to try and kill every cliche in the Western, right? The Western is full of all of these things that it doesn't do, and we're going to try and do them. And in that sense, even though, as I said before, he is really not a member of the counterculture. He's the wrong generation. And in some ways, he's much more affectionate towards the big systems than a lot of the sort of boomers. He really also does have this sense of there are things that I'm going to try and smash in the process of making these movies. I'm going to make sure that you never see them again. And, part of that, and this is something that I think lands more even than it did then, although it certainly did then, right, is this inclusion of a Black hero into this. I mean, in the book, I call the movie "Guess Who's Coming to the Campfire Dinner." After this sort of civil rights era kind of movie, right? But this is really just saying, like, oh, it's reminding you that so much of the structure of this time that is being portrayed in these sort of beautiful John Ford tones is populated by people who were incurably racist. And that becomes part of the story that Brooks wants to tell about these ethnic others who are not Jewish in the movie, right? But are also, you can think about Jews kind of in the background there too, right? Of coming in and meeting this kind of hostility. And then at the end, a certain kind of, at least rapprochement, if not full acceptance. And that's important.
I'm glad you brought up the farting scene. It makes me think that, Brooks would he would do anything for a laugh. And maybe this comes from like that Borscht Belt thing of like, if the people are in the audience are starting to grow restless, like, what do you do? Maybe you make a funny fart sound or something. But like, I don't, if we're going to pair like the other sort of paired person culturally with Brooks would maybe be Woody Allen. I don't know if there's a fart joke in any Woody Allen movie. But Brooks, is like, the lowest, earthiest form of humor, farting, along with like, the like critiquing Nazis, this critique of racism, much more high concept stuff. So like the range of his comedic vision is, much larger than in his contemporaries, I think. And it does seem to be sort of like, just like keep them entertained, do anything to get a laugh. And especially when you go to the extremely high concept things like the end of the movie where, or just the end of Young Frankenstein, which is the one where they're like running through the studio set and like there's the
no, it's the end of Blazing Saddles. You're right. It's the end of Blazing Saddles.
Yeah, an extremely like sort of postmodern high concept humor combined with fart jokes. That does seem unusual.
No, I think that's right. And, I think it's funny. I mean, because as you know, failure is an orphan, success has 1,000 parents. That usually everyone wants to take credit for everything, right? Anything good in a movie, everyone wants to say, oh, I did that. That was me, right? But everybody agrees, even though the Blazing Saddles script was a collaborative effort in many ways, there was a writer's room, that idea was Brooks's idea, right? That kind of postmodern, kind of very intellectual, kind of breaking the fourth wall, that was Brooks. And I really do think, and I talk about this a lot in the book, because of course everyone was comparing Brooks and Allen, that, in many ways, Brooks really is an intellectual. He goes on to be a producer who produces a lot of these sort of very highbrow films. As I said earlier, he follows the producers with this other movie that's sort of very interesting, but which is based on this sort of Russian Jewish novel from the early 20th century. He really was a kind of intellectual. Allen always said that he was not an intellectual. He always says this in interviews. And one of the things that I think is the most interesting about all of the discourse of the 1970s and on is that nobody actually takes him at his word. And I think I think Allen in many ways is, and I think he would agree with this assessment, he seems to, a pseudo-intellectual. And I think that uses sort of this kind of rhetoric, but to almost deflate it to show kind of, but not really to try and think through things very much, right? And Brooks in many ways is really very thoughtful about what he wants to do. He's just thoughtful in the sense that he also understands that you can be thoughtful and tell lots of fart jokes.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you are a person who uses social media, but every couple weeks or so, it seems like something will trend where some cultural object from the past and people will be like, oh, you couldn't make this today. Like, you could never get away with this today. They wouldn't let you make a movie like this or whatever. And I've definitely seen people say you couldn't make a movie like Blazing Saddles today. I don't know whether that's true or not. I mean, the racial politics have definitely changed. Do you have any thoughts on that? If
well,
the taboos and so forth.
I'll just say two things about it. I mean, one is that even Mel Brooks is not sure that he would make Blazing Saddles exactly the same way today. But, and I think this is a very important but, is not because of its politics, right? And in fact, one of the interesting things about doing the research for the book was that you really find that black papers, really at the time are like, this is an anti-racist movie, right? Which it is. It really is a movie that's really putting the burden and showing sort of the white supremacists in films. The way in which it's done, I think even Mel Brooks feels like he wouldn't be able to get away with today. He shouldn't, and do it in a different way, right? But in terms of it's not because of the politics in a certain kind of way. I have to think about it. So that's one thing. I do think also that everything is the product of its time. I mean, as we were saying, it's very difficult in certain ways to understand the appeal of some of the aspects of your show of shows. Now, certainly that is not sort of lasted quite as long as maybe it could have. And that's not because of necessarily anything objectionable, but simply because much of the stuff that it's talking about just really doesn't apply anymore. Mm-hmm. I think that, one of the things that was the most interesting, I grew up of the era to see Spaceballs in the theater, and I loved it as a kid. But looking at it as an adult, it's interesting because Brooks said when he made it, that this was the first of his parodies that he made that he had no real personal connection to. He said he made it because his kid was a fan of the Star Wars stuff, and he understood that. And I think that it actually kind of shows. There's something about when you're a parodist or something, or that being very much in the particular moment that has to, how would I put this? Something that, you're in the particular moment that makes it work, that makes you sort of vibrant and vital. Mm-hmm. And that's harder when you're just sort of doing it because, your kids or your grandkids tell you that this is the thing.
Right. And, it wouldn't, this whole putting aside, whether you could make a movie that was so like non-politically correct today, it wouldn't make sense to make a Western parody, anymore these days. Like, the Western has been dethroned and, dissected, and there's been revisionist and postmodern Westerns, but just like a broad parody of a Western wouldn't make any sense in the current climate because that form has been digested and regurgitated so many times.
I think that there's always, one of the things the next book I'm working on, or one of the next books I'm working on is a history of American horror. And I was happy to find that like from the beginning of horror, there have been horror parodies, right? It's sort of like from the first years that you start making horror movies, people are already making fun of them. And my sense is that it's not about sort of the deconstruction that prohibits the parody, but it's about the vitality and the vibrancy of the medium to the current attention span, right? So I think what you're talking about, at least if I may, what I think that you're seeing is a kind of mostly exhaustion with the Western as a kind of current thing. That's not to say entirely. There's still stuff in, Yellowstone may end up revivifying it so much that we'll have a Yellowstone parody and people will love it. Right. But for right now, we seem to be in a moment where if you were, I'm not a movie executive, but if you were going to have two parody scripts in front of you and one of them was making fun of Westerns and one of them was making fun of superheroes, I know which one I would pick.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we're probably towards the end of our time. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
Let me think about that. I do think that we haven't talked at all about Young Frankenstein.
Right.
And I just would say that in many ways, one of the things that's very interesting about Young Frankenstein is that it ends up being a movie that Mel Brooks is not in it, right? He doesn't star in it. And he writes it with Gene Wilder. That is sort of a movie that is actually much deeper than simply a parody of horror movies. It's a movie about sort of identity and assimilation. And even though there's not a Jewish word in it, very much deeply about Jewishness. So if you're interested out there in how that's so, pick up the book.
Would you, maybe last question, or definitely last question, is he the dominant comedic figure in America after World War II? Is there any, who, the only challenger could be, I think, Woody Allen, and probably for various reasons, people don't want to think a ton about him anymore. Who else could possibly challenge him?
Yeah, I think that one of the things, in a sort of synergistic coincidence. The book came out the day after History of the World Part 2 premiered on Hulu.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and the History of the World Part 2 is a lot like a lot of Mel Brooks movies, if we're being honest, which is it's got some amazing bits and it's got some less amazing bits. And, as years will go on, you'll remember the amazing bits and forget the less amazing bits.
Mm-hmm.
But what was incredibly inspiring was that, you saw just this incredibly wide, heterogeneous group of comedians of all different places, all different backgrounds, who clearly all worshipped Mel Brooks for what he meant to them. And that's why they were all in this show,
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I think, if you're doing so many different kinds of comedy, as you say, vulgar comedy, other kinds of parody, even intellectual comedy, witty comedy, ethnic comedy, and, all of these in people's own ways, they're taking lessons from that. The only person I can think of who has that same kind of, influence, and it was, and it's more among comedians in some ways, but was Lenny Bruce, who was able, and you hear over and over again comedians of just a staggering variety of backgrounds saying, Bruce spoke his truth. He spoke, who he was, and that gave me the license to speak mine. Right. So regardless of what that was, so he's the only competitor, but I think, Brooks had better box office.
Right. And, Bruce, I mean, he died fairly young. So his
Correct.
influence is more like as a iconoclast or maybe turning point in the culture. And Mel Brooks still with us. And yeah, maybe there's something about a lot of his stuff can be encountered or understood at one level by a child. Some of them are explicitly children's movies, maybe the later ones. And maybe there's something that like lodges itself in your head if you see this as a kid and then you become an adult performer. Like no kid is watching Andy Hall at like 7 years old, whereas you would watch some of these Brooks movies and they just become sort of like part of your comedic psyche. So that influence is maybe, is going to be more long lasting or something.
I think that's right. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Should we end things there?
That sounds great. Yes. Thank you so much for this. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you for coming on. So Mel Brooks, Disobedient Jew. A link will be in the show notes where people can get the book. It's part of the Yale series of Jewish Lives. If people want to follow you anywhere else, would you direct them to a website or a social media feed or anything like that?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Jeremy Dauber, Dauber, and I'd love for people to follow me there.
Okay, great. So thank you again for coming on. I enjoyed the book a lot. If people want to learn about Mel Brooks, I would say this is the best way to do it. And so thanks to all the listeners out there. We'll see you again next time.